Hoosiers with disabilities today are leading independent lives. They are contributing to their communities, working to make life better for themselves and others. Changes in legislation, government policy, and public attitudes have improved the quality of life for today's citizens with disabilities. People with disabilities and their allies are achieving these improvements through a hard-won struggle for equal rights. The story of Indiana's disability history is the story of a journey to full citizenship. It is a journey towards equal opportunities in employment, education, housing, equal access to public buildings and transportation. It's a journey towards freedom from discrimination, abuse, and neglect.
Journey to Full Citizenship, Indiana's Disability History.
In its early history, Indiana opened state schools for young people who were blind or had low vision, and for those who were deaf or hard of hearing. These residential schools provided comprehensive education. The Indiana Institute for the Education of the Blind was established in 1847. The Indiana School for the Deaf was the first state school in the U.S. to provide free education to students with hearing impairments. Both schools have evolved and endured into the 21st century.
Unfit to reproduce.
By the end of the 19th century, many Hoosiers with disabilities were considered a burden to society. Indiana created institutions placing people behind walls and locked doors. For example, individuals might remain for years or a lifetime at the Indiana Hospital for the Insane or the Asylum for Feeble-Minded Children. Their care was inadequate. There were few opportunities to learn.
But their days weren't not good. The units were overcrowded, quite frankly. If you wanted any privacy, there wasn't any way for you to have privacy. It was a pretty bleak day for most people, even the children.
Along with institutions, the practice of eugenics arose as a method of controlling the disabled population across the U.S. Those promoting eugenics believed that society could be improved by using biology and genetics to determine who was fit or unfit to live. They wished to prevent anyone from having children whom they thought had undesirable traits.
Indiana was the first place in the world that had a sterilization law.
The darkest moment of Indiana's disability history may have been in 1907, when it became the first state in the nation to legislate mandatory sterilization of some of its citizens. Harry Clay Sharp was an influential physician who, by 1909, had sterilized hundreds of inmates at the Indiana Reformatory in Jeffersonville. Indiana's legislation targeted people with disabilities as, quote, defective. Most victims of involuntary sterilization over the 6 decades after 1907 were institutionalized people with intellectual and/or developmental disabilities. The Indiana Plan, as Dr. Sharp referred to it, anticipated similar laws in other states. In 1974, Governor Otis R. Bowen signed a law repealing all of Indiana's compulsory sterilization statutes. At least 2,000 adults and children had been forcibly sterilized in Indiana between 1907 and 1974.
Hidden away.
Institutionalization of people with intellectual and other developmental disabilities persisted through the 20th century. Doctors advised parents to permanently separate their child with a disability from family and community. Well into the 1960s and 70s, experts pronounced institutional placement to be best, that the child with a disability would put too much of a burden on their parents and siblings. Linda Hubler recalls the birth of her son with Down syndrome in 1964.
The first thing the nurse said, "You're not taking him home, are you?" Just like that was the normal thing.
My wife and I would have nothing of that, so we took him home, and we raised him with his 3 brothers.
Linda and her husband, like many other parents, disregarded medical advice, raising their child Mark with his siblings in New Albany. Children with disabilities who lived with their families had no options for schooling.
We had a group of mothers in the late 40s, early 50s, that got together and said, there's got to be something else.
Parents led the way and organized to establish educational programs in locations such as church basements.
Closing institutions.
Populations of institutions in the United States peaked in 1967. Revelations of institutional abuse of patients began to appear in the media. Disability advocates pressed for closures, and professionals changed their ideas about where people with disabilities belong.
He had bruises all over his arms, and he had scabs. And I remember seeing these round scabs on his arm when I was a kid, and I just knew that something evil was going on there.
After abuses came to light in 1994, Central State Hospital in Indianapolis was the first Indiana institution to close. A few years later, hidden television cameras exposed the abuse of residents by employees at the Newcastle State Developmental Center. The shocking news reports received national coverage and led to the center's closure. Indiana began the process of shutting down its remaining institutions. In 2007, Indiana became one of the first states in the nation to close all of its large state institutions for people with intellectual disabilities. That same year, Indiana observed the centennial of the 1907 sterilization law. Officials apologized for the state's role in the eugenics movement. A historic marker placed at the Indiana State Library was unveiled by Jamie Coleman, a victim of sterilization.
Living in the community.
People moving out of institutions needed places to live. Group homes for adults with intellectual and/or developmental disabilities were introduced into Indiana communities in the 1970s and 80s. Sometimes facing the opposition of neighbors, group homes offered residents who had spent decades in institutions freedom to make choices about their daily lives they had never been able to make. Community mental health centers were established to deliver care to those released from state hospitals. Individuals who had performed jobs in their institutions without pay, a practice called peonage, were promised the opportunity to learn job skills in sheltered workshops with sub-minimal wages. The services required for people with disabilities to live in their communities meant moving federal and state dollars out of institutional budgets. The Home and Community-Based Waiver Program became available in Indiana in 1990. The shift from institutional funding to Medicaid waiver services has significantly lowered the per-person cost of public support. A shortage of state funding, however, soon produced long waiting lists for these community-based services. A task force of Hoosiers with disabilities, their advocates, and state officials came together in 1998 to address the problem. They identified 6,000 unserved individuals with developmental disabilities. The 317 Commission's influential report charted the course for a new direction in community supports and resulted in $157 million in new state funding.
The struggle for civil rights.
People with disabilities themselves have driven much of the betterment of their own lives. Individuals with mobility limitations have established independent living centers in Indiana and across the U.S. They have organized protests against inaccessible buildings and transportation systems. Indiana advocates for people who are deaf or hard of hearing have fought for access to telecommunications technology, captioning, and American Sign Language interpreters. Hoosiers with intellectual disabilities introduced the People First movement to Indiana. In 1990, they united under a statewide organization, Self-Advocates of Indiana.
Most proudest thing would be getting Self-Advocates started. That's showing people what all the special stuff that disability people can do, you know.
Going around the state and training people on what self-advocacy was and the importance of it, and just really getting the organization started. And that was, in the middle of doing it, it was a lot of fun, but it was a lot of hard work.
2020 is the 30th anniversary of Self-Advocates of Indiana. Indiana Self-Advocates have demanded equality and respect, working to eliminate demeaning language such as the R word. In 2019, Governor Eric Holcomb signed legislation recognizing supported decision-making as a cornerstone of self-determination. Federal laws such as the Rehabilitation Act of 1973 have been essential to securing disability rights. For the first time, students with disabilities were guaranteed the right to a free public education in 1975. But disability rights activists cite the 1990 adoption of the Americans with Disabilities Act as the most significant civil rights legislation in U.S. history. Many Hoosiers worked tirelessly for its passage and implementation, yet they say the law is not adequately enforced. It faces ongoing threats of revision or elimination. In a landmark decision in 1999, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that unjustified segregation of persons with disabilities constitutes discrimination. In the so-called Olmsted case, 2 women filed suit under the ADA for release from a state hospital. The court clearly affirmed the rights of people with disabilities to live outside of institutions.
Hoosiers with Disabilities Today.
Indiana can be proud it has closed its large institutions for Hoosiers with intellectual and/or developmental disabilities, a major accomplishment. Waiting lists have been reduced for services that make it possible for people to live in their own communities instead of being locked in institutions. Indiana's Department of Vocational Rehabilitation has determined that a competitive job in the community, not placement in a sheltered workshop, is the desired employment outcome. Advances in technology have helped to level the playing field. Students are moving out of segregated special education into classrooms with their peers. Mark Hubler, whose parents didn't listen to advice to institutionalize him, attended community college.
I want to be just like my 3 brothers. They went to college, and I want to be a college student. So I went to college with what's called the Down Syndrome of Louisville Connection. It felt great to be a college student. I mean, I had many friends over there.
Despite these successes, inequalities persist for Hoosiers with disabilities. Hoosiers with disabilities are more than twice as likely to be in poverty and 3 times as likely to be unemployed as those without disabilities. Support for competitive employment has stagnated. There are great disparities in the health status of Indiana citizens with and without disabilities. Most adults with intellectual and/or developmental disabilities in Indiana live with their families. Yet almost a quarter of family caregivers are age 60 or older, aging out of their ability to provide supports. In the 21st century, Hoosiers with disabilities have come a long way on their journey to full citizenship. The struggle for full civil rights and equality is not over.
To learn more, please visit indianadisabilityhistory.org.